Hello, BookTube. I have a little extra TBR torture for you. You might think, well, you certainly can't get away with that, but I've consulted with numerous lawyers, and they say that torture is illegal on many different grounds, civil, civic, and personal, and moral, but only torture people, and sometimes animals. I can torture your TBR, these lawyers say, until the cows come home. And that's what I'm going to do. I have 4 books I want to show you here. Many of them I think we've probably seen on this channel. I want to give you a little bit of deeper dive into them and recommend them to you. And the first one is a novel. It's a historical novel by J.R. Moringer. And it's about Willie Sutton, who was called in his day, in the early part of the 20th century, the Babe Ruth of bank robbers. And this is a historical novel called Sutton that is just about him. This is the review copy from 2012. So this came out in 2012. And it's Sutton looking back on his life and adventures as an older man. And I wanted to read you a bit of it because it's really good historical fiction. The only thing by this author that I've ever really liked. And I really did like it. And this is Sutton being taken on his first plane ride. As part of a newspaper interview / gimmick. The plane has 4 seats, 2 in the front, 2 in the back. Reporter straps Sutton into one of the back seats, then sits up front next to the pilot. A few snowflakes fall as they taxi down the runway. They come to a full stop, and the pilot talks into the radio, and the radio crackles back with numbers and codes, and Sutton suddenly remembers the first time he rode in a car, which was stolen. Well, bought with stolen money, which Sutton stole. He was almost 18, and steering that new car down the road felt like flying. Now, 50 years later, he's going to fly through the air. He feels a painful pressure building below his heart. This is not safe. He reads every day in the paper about another plane scattered in pieces on some mountaintop, in some field, some lake. Gravity is no joke. Gravity is one of the few laws he's never broken. He'd rather be in Donald's GTO right now, fishtailing on icy back roads. Maybe he can pay Donald to drive him to New York. Maybe he'll take the bus. Heck, he'll walk. But first he needs to get out of this plane. He claws at his seatbelt. The engine gives a high, piercing whine, and the plane rears back like a horse and goes screaming down the runway. Sutton thinks of the astronauts. He thinks of Lindbergh. He thinks of the bald man in the red long johns who used to get shot from a cannon on Coney Island. He closes his eyes and says a prayer and clutches his shopping bag. When he opens his eyes again, the full moon is Jackie Gleasoning him through the window. Within 30 minutes, they make out the lights of Manhattan. Then the Statue of Liberty glowing green and gold out in the harbor. Sutton presses his face against the window. One-armed goddess. She's waving to him, beckoning him, calling him home. The plane tilts sideways and swoops toward LaGuardia. The landing is smooth. As they slow and taxi toward the terminal, a reporter turns to check on Sutton. "You okay, Mr. Sutton?" "Let's go again, kid." A reporter smiles. This is, I mean, I won't oversell this in terms of saying that any of the rest of the characters are portrayed as well as Sutton is. But Sutton is done really well in the course of this book, and I think that's the whole point of a historical novel that's entirely about him. And then the next 3 I want to show you are nonfiction. And the first one is right up your alley. It's a study of books. It's a study of literature and bookish reception throughout American history. It's the bookish reception history of American literature, one of many. But this was one of the first ones that I ever read. This was, I don't think it'll ever be reprinted. You'll never see this in a very sturdy edition. This was from 1950. It's a 1950 Oxford University Press paperback. It's by James Hart, and it's called The Popular Book, A History of American Literary Taste. This is by the author who did the Oxford Companion to American Literature. I think he did the first Oxford Companion to American Literature. And in this, he just looks at various iconic American books and talks about their reception, their conception, a little bit about their authors, and it's just wonderful. It's not dry at all. He has an amazing way of bringing these things to life. But once again, I want to read you something. This is from early on in the book. This is about my beloved Washington Irving and his book, The Sketchbook, which was a runaway success in America and in Europe. The Sketchbook was a great success. Its first printing of 2,000 copies sold quickly. The dreamily poetic mood, quiet antiquarian interest, and picturesque legendary appealed to a public accustomed to Scott, that's Sir Walter Scott, and searching for an interpreter of its own past. Although Irving lacked the vigor and amplitude of Scott or Cooper, that's James Fenimore Cooper, and it's absolutely not true. He has their vigor. Just as he lacked the philosophic introspection of the intellectual romanticist, his work had the patina of romanticism cherished by the public. His purpose, Irving wrote, was, quote, to escape from the commonplace realities of the present and lose myself among the shadowy grandeurs of the past, close quote. Which is just what his plum pudding and holly tales of England and his pastel-colored creation of American folklore perfectly succeeded in doing. His gently humorous sentiment and graceful evocation of quaint and distant times in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, and other tales delighted his contemporary public. After the publication of the sketchbook, readers looked forward to another work by their new favorite, and the New York Evening Post declared, quote, there is as much anxiety for its appearance as there would be for a novel of Scott's or a poem of Byron's. And that combination, you notice there, even in that little excerpt, there's a combination of lots and lots of insight on the part of the author and also lots and lots of research, just quietly and confidently slipped in there without any heaviness at all. And the whole book is like that. I wish that I had a sturdier copy than this. I don't think this would take another reading. But in terms of a really readable, criticism-based history of American literary taste, it's fantastic. Things like this just don't age. And this next one is something we've seen on this channel before. This is by a great author, and it's I got it as part of a reclamation project of T.S. Eliot. I am reclaiming T.S. Eliot, or at least re-examining him in 2019. So I've been getting some texts, not only his texts. The publisher sent me some beautiful annotated scholarly paperbacks of his poems, but also biographies and books about him, including this one, which I found at the Brattle. This is Russell Kirk, Eliot and His Age. Russell Kirk was a smelly, brilliant, old, cantankerous, old-school Republican whose political writings made him famous in his day and afterwards, and whose passion, of course, as is usually the case with people whose political writings make them famous, his passions were literary. And he wrote this book on Eliot back in the 70s, I think? 1971, and he revised it. This is the revised 1984 edition. And it's fantastic. Russell Kirk, I tell you, what a writer. And I want to read you a bit. This is just his study of T.S. Eliot, all the people that informed him, all of his contemporaries once he became famous. And I want to read you a bit just so you get a sense, not so much of T.S. Eliot as of Russell Kirk. He's talking about, you know, the theological balderdahl that goes through T.S. Eliot like a virus. So saith the Lord, give, sympathize, control. But though the seeker has found courage to carry him to the chapel perilous and to ask the dread question, has he resolution and faith sufficient to induce him to obey the thunder? Some rain has fallen, but the sacred river wants a flood. Mind and flesh are feeble. For lack of human daring, the wasteland may remain ghastly dry. Give, that means surrender, yielding to something outside of oneself. If sexual union is to be fertile, there must occur surrender of self in some degree, momentary self-effacement in another. Lust, too true, may produce progeny, but those are the bats with baby faces. Larger even than procreation, giving or surrender means the subordination of the self, of the arrogant private rationality, to an authority with a capital A, long derided and neglected. Can modern man humble himself enough to surrender unconditionally to the thunder from on high? Sympathize. That means love and loyalty and the diminishing of private claims. We all lie in the prison house of self-pity. And to recognize the reality of other selves more, to act upon that reality, must require unusual strength, the virtue of caritas. The overweening modern ego has grown fat on the doctrine of self-admiration. The community of souls has been falling apart for some centuries now. Control. That, as Babbitt has said, is to place restraints upon will and appetite. To control, true control is exerted not through force as a master, but by self-discipline and persuasion of others. Yet can the strutting will restrain itself by its own act? Can modern appetites, so long unchecked, so long gorged on blood and foulness as during the war, be confined once more to their proper place? We have indulged the libido. Now can we return to the other kinds of freedom, voluntas, to Cicero's ordered and willed freedom? Our desires are insatiable, and thunder is distant. And that'll give you a sense. That gives you a sense all throughout. This is not really a work of Eliot's scholarship. This is a work of Russell Kirk. Everything Russell Kirk wrote, no matter what the subject was always him. The subject was always really him. But that is the prose of someone who's just taking joy in hammering away things on a typewriter. That is just, if you like that sort of thing, you get a whole book of it in here. And it might prompt you, I don't know, to seek out Russell Kirk's writings. Other Russell Kirk's writings. And then the last thing I want to show you, what would a TBR torture be without an enormous work of history? This is a 1,000-page work of history. This is by Robert Massey. I have praised it on this channel before. This is Dreadnought. This is Britain and Germany and the coming of the Great War. As you can tell from the two faces on the cover, that is Kaiser Wilhelm and his uncle, my guy, King Edward VII. And this is all about, it's an enormous book about the build-up to World War II, not just in terms of the creation, financing, and propagation of the Dreadnought warship, but also all of the behind-the-scenes social and economic stuff that was going on in Germany and Great Britain at the time. And that might sound really dry. This book has long profiles of obscure German financiers and second-rung British civil servants and whatnot. And you might think that just could not be interesting, and this book is interesting from first page to last. It's incredible. An incredible reading experience. Massey followed it up years later with a book called Castles of Steel. He follows the Dreadnought and its model descendants into war. And it's a really good book too, but this book is just amazing. Just incredible. And I want to read you I won't read you anything really abstruse or detailed, but I want to read you an example of what Massey does all throughout this book. Oh, hello, baby. Hello. Hi, baby. He not only concentrates on the history, he makes sure to pepper it with anecdotes. And boy, oh boy, does he have an ear for anecdotes, whether they're funny or tragic. But because I put you through this torture, I'm going to read you a funny one. This is about the aging Queen Victoria, before she dies and Edward takes the throne. With the passage of time, the Queen's sense of humor, suppressed first by the rigid decorum imposed by Prince Albert, and then by the burden of grief imposed by Albert's death, resurfaced. Although Albert was never forgotten, and every day the Queen was at Windsor, she visited the Frogmore Mausoleum, she did begin to smile, then to laugh, then to roar with laughter, over pomposity undone, pretense revealed, or language ludicrously misused. At dinner one night at Osborne House, the Queen entertained a famous admiral whose hearing was impaired. Politely, Victoria had asked about the fleet and its activities, then, shifting the subject, she asked about the admiral's sister, an elderly dowager of awesome dignity. The admiral thought she was inquiring about his flagship, which was in need of an overhaul. "Well, ma'am," he said, "as soon as I get back, I'm going to have her hauled out, roll her on her side, and have the barnacles scraped off her bottom." Victoria stared at him for a second, and then, for minutes afterwards, the dining room shook with her unstoppable peals of laughter. And that is wonderfully done. It's not just that anecdote is perfectly retold. It's the language, right? Even before we get to the anecdote, that bit about, what is it? Pomposity undone, pretense revealed, or language ludicrously misused. That is just wonderful stuff. And this book is full of that. No matter how in the weeds it gets with the financiers who brought about the war, who were diligently preparing for something that they didn't want to happen. No matter how in the weeds he gets with those people, you are always in the presence of a great storyteller, someone who knows that he's getting really wonky and wants to keep your attention. Boy, oh boy, if you see this book at a used bookstore or a yard sale or something or other, you should get it and try it. It is one of those gigantic history books that you will read and love, even though it's big. You'll want more of it. And you have a little more of it in Castles of Steel. Castles of Steel is also very good. It's just, I think this is a highlight, really. So there you have it. There's a totally gratuitous torture session of your TBR. So we have Dreadnought by Robert Massey. High recommendation. If you see it, get it. Then Russell Kirk, we have Eliot and His Age, which is Russell Kirk at his most apocalyptic prose-wise. Just going into Eliot's works, you could see how that passage that we read it may have started out about the wasteland, but it quickly became about something else entirely, the Book of Revelation. Most of Russell Kirk is the Book of Revelation in quasi-political form. And then we have James Hart's The Popular Book, which is all about the books that became popular in America and why and who made them popular and how we know they were popular, what was said about them. Fascinating if you're interested in American literature. And lastly, a historical novel, and that is Sutton by J.D. Moringer, about a classic criminal, classic bank robber, but a wonderful portrait of the man, especially, battered a little by time. So there you go. That's yet more TBR torture for you. And who knows, I may do the same thing tomorrow. I can't be stopped. I am the Babe Ruth of TBR torture. But anyway, I'll wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.